Đang 좀 나랑 아주 거기 동함이 돼버려 되어버려 다 되어야 띵이 되어지고 얼마도 내가 안에 님의 진이다 주제 같이 되어지 다 저기 지금 말와 지사다 띵이 되어지고 그래서 띵이 되어지 그래용 그리 토고에서는 다 다르고 봐 녀모바 사본에 제바 방비 뻥바 방비 고된 토요도 다르바세 토고래 지사디 다르고 봐 토바이나 되네 띵이 되어지 토바레스 지사다 다르베 토고래 다 탈바 토고 엔자다 되니기 띵이 되어 탈바디 토발라 안 탈바 토고도 선배 탈바 돈이게 삼로되는 주기를 기고거래 지사다 탈바 돈이게 삼로디 기고바 인자 다디 탈바 돈이게 삼로 기와디 탑리아 가르쳐서네 탈바 돈이 삼로 기와라 너 코발에 닝보 매바 통고거래 코발에 닝보 매바 통고거래 코발에 닝보 매바 토와이나 코발에 닝보 민도 대산델레 탈비 타바 토구도 셈베 타바도 이기고라 코발에 닝보 매바 통고거래 다 코발에 닝보 매바 통화라 코위 니수되게 하고 고거라다 대 하고 고원자 다디네 자다 하고 원자다 너 코위 니수되 코와세디 디네 아 지금 레연이 원게 방디 기비게 코와 풍부디게다 니수 간에 세디 안 되네 세디 대지사 도시나 주게다 거의 동화 가서 풍부 디기 아주 가르 깨와 기회기 동화 가래 요래 내가 게르비기 동화 가래 요래 세디 어도시는 요래 생아주 다도시 시고야디 임센로디 코발에 니봄에 바토야 코발에 니봄에 바토나 코발에 탈되게 털네 타바등에 삼바기야지 타바등에 삼바기와 있나 안 타바 디토비 쳐도 람나 베즈체에도 아니 녀모바바 사번에 제가 방비 방바 타바 토용을 타바 톱나는 저기 대미유 띵이 되어 토여게 되어 나신 미유디 루버와다 디인자당은 저데 코르기 내탕 내수균 덴데덴데 요래세디 다가상도 도신 제시ገብ제 기회 동안 나다 가윈 동안 데데네게 도신에 쉬어와다.
Good morning. So we all sitting here together with one deep abiding wish in common, and that is to abide in happiness and never to experience any suffering, problems, or difficulties. And to be specific about the kind of happiness that all beings yearn for, it's a lasting happiness, a stable happiness, a happiness that is never punctuated by even the slightest of problem or difficulty. This is the type of happiness we yearn for, but have yet to experience. This kind of happiness is the very happiness that a being who is liberated from samsara, has achieved liberation, has achieved. Because that happiness that is unpunctuated by even a moment of suffering is a happiness that is attained when one has abandoned the afflictions together with their seeds. When the causes of suffering have been completely abandoned, one will never experience suffering again and thereby abides in lasting, stable happiness. So therefore, to develop or to attain this heartfelt wish of abiding in lasting happiness, one needs to cultivate a specific sequence of causes. This immediately, so therefore, one needs to develop a deep and sincere yearning for liberation, for the state of lasting, stable happiness. But to develop this to the extent that it is our abiding motivation behind all that we do, one has to come to recognize the actual situation of our samsaric existence, so as to give rise to the wish to be liberated from our samsaric existence. This requires coming to recognize that there is no abiding value in any samsaric rebirth or the various pleasures of samsara. To come to actually recognize this, one needs to see the faults of samsara with vivid clarity so that one recognizes for oneself there is nothing worthy of striving for within samsara. All that's worthy of striving for is what is liberated from samsara. So to come to recognize the faults of samsara, we are looking at this presentation on the eightfold presentation of suffering, of which last time we looked at the first, the suffering of birth, and last night we started to look at the second, the suffering of aging. So again, the process of these reflections, the very purpose of engaging in these meditations, is to lift this veil of ignorance with which we engage in our samsaric experience, thinking that these insignificant problems have great value when they do not, thinking that the attainment of trivial pleasures has great value when it does not, and rather come to recognize that nothing within samsara has any abiding value, but that liberation is possible and is possible for me. And that arises, then one gives rise to the determined attitude to cultivate true paths, to cultivate the qualities that will lead to true cessations, to lead to the abandonment of the afflictions together with their seeds.
코와레 마타와데 가르스는 코웨에 코와레 차바다 셴바 차신이 지된 니기 견진에 털고 말아 차신 개와데 가르스는 코웨에 균 마타와자 그디네 윤된 양양제 취미이제 계제 아니 야고양야 통되제 균 마타와자 니기 차신디 차바데 기디거와 제 차신계디 차바계디 취미이제 용이 기워레제就是催眠一些呢，的插花界，的插花的插身界对吧？人家按这里啊，在这个什么机构嘛的，给的那的伢都马上就掉啊，身边什么之类的个了吧的，插的人家就考完了，他都过嘛的，人家的人家的，这里啊，这个考完了，卷的有的是卷的个都是拿着卷的个把好过样的，按这了到他人不民多啊，身边同样的，对。대리아 자신 총주고래 지상아저 가상 쉬반에 잘라들이야 닝보 민도 베제 민도 선비게 판도 민도 선비 섬토나 잘라 레요도 잘라들 자신 매바체 되는 바 유야다 디용고와 어디 나신다 되네 장아저 공부나서 공부를 자신디 차와디 되고 이제 자신 죽지만 자고 대리아 안디 하고야 된다라 딜이야 자야 된다 딜 교연이 통고거라 교연 통고거라 모연이서도 하고 봐지고 대연장은 저기 풍비기 교연 아주 교연되게 되는 요래서야지 교연 시화비 송거 김제로 시디로와 대양 삼단하디 소수기 소설레스 당보 소설이야 삼당고 그래서 지난 소수기 개와다 대 소수기 홍보될 되는 제게 동화 가르가르 기회 동화 가르 휴어래 안에 가위 동화 가르 용도 도시는 삼단데 소수 풍보들 다시 가르선 차신계 소수라는 소수 풍보를 차신계 되지 엔디기 타고 우인스 하고 말 대연장 소수 풍보도 도시는 제바제 심주제 도시에 되는 풍부기 니수도 하고도 어다 님보민도 선배게 안데 삼로시 용거래 님보메 봤으면 통해도 어다 될래 타고도 선배 탈되게 삼바지 용거래 해서다 된다디디래 다간도 그 도시네 가위기회 동화다 가위 동화서 교연되는 요래서 네 제바제야 삼단 게 송해야 돼 뒤로와 된다.
What we through these meditations are striving to challenge and eventually abandon is our attachment, our clinging to samsara. This faulty way of engaging with samsaric phenomena, this is what we need to recognize and abandon. Because why is it that we are attached to something? It's because immediately preceding the mind of attachment is improper mental engagement, a mind that exaggerates the qualities of our body, of phenomena around us, and so forth. Through exaggerating the qualities, we yearn for it, we want it, we think this will lead to some happiness if I achieve it. This is a misconception. It's misconceiving how phenomena exist in the sense of believing that something can lead to happiness when it cannot. So this we need to challenge. And this is the very purpose behind these 8 sufferings, meditating on the 8 sufferings, so that we can come to recognize that all that we are attached to actually has no abiding value. And all that we are attached to, despite how it appearing to us, actually cannot lead to the attainment of lasting happiness. And therefore, as it cannot lead to happiness, why be attached to it? So through going through these meditations in the way that's presented, doing so in detail, repeatedly over a sustained period, before what would appear to us, for example, our body, as something as worthy of being attached to, we come to recognize how it really exists, and thereby our attachment doesn't arise to the same magnitude, and eventually not at all. And coming with that will be the recognition of what does actually lead to lasting happiness, complete cessation of afflictions such as attachment and clinging, and thereby one strives to cultivate the virtuous qualities of the paths so as to achieve liberation from samsara.
Dine zada yang anzu phungbo dusin anzu phungbo de ningbo meba ane chasen na de ningbo meba ane jigi delya yi mon migewa ningbo meba 통고 고래에서 직 송여도 양 데니게 삼다에도 양 어다데 풍벌 레닝보 민도 세비기다 삼다진에된 풍벌이야 랑그 수봉이야 아직 배균 단배 낭총 단에 다음에 지데 될래야 아니 송교 가야 맞아 되니 제배네 삼로디 노트체고래 제가 땅 한주기 풍벌이 균디 된데 누워 선배 통제 윤통 통한다 다 딜레 제위기 풍부 데니기 꿰매 바치 토고도 선비게 삼당에도 다디 토베게 탑람라 비주다야라 아주 데데 풍부 딜레야 띠엔지 비주다나마도 셴 탑시 가야요 말에 제가 다데 띠엔딜레 비주 풍부 딜라 띠엔지 비주당고 개와스 개주 주고 원자 풍부디 띠엔지 개주 주발라 풍부디 야고치 고고랑 수부디 야고치 고고래 수보려야 내 나자다 강아체네 양 아주 기주주의를 발치지고 두고 말해 대인사 당 아주 공로 삼모들라 아주 풍보디 레다 녀모의 샹와진 인보 매바 두치네 괜지 퇴통 통위 디데네다 다 델레 야가 탈비고만 토고 선비 삼로 공로라 니토네 다 탈비고만도 개위 냠는 제발라 풍보 류딘 델라 맞댔나 탑람 민두 재산 류딘 델레야 괜쇼 내에서 강아 채바이나 이 탑람 주투야를 바치지기도 다디 류딘딩아 탈바 냠는 제발라야 그거 배시 첨보시도 지상 고롱 되네기 괜지 여바이나야 얘네하다 탈베 냠는 제발라 그거 배시 여바치레샤 선백 토네 소솔이야 풍보라 차신난 제위 토 차신난 제 풍보디랑이 최 냠는 제발로 그거 여바 판도 여바의 삼는 땅위 토네 먼저 풍벌이야 송급제다 다고제 두로 관계하다 장자 제고야다 아니 내나怎么样 탑람 면주 제화되게 제고야디 예체모디 차고래
These meditations lead us to the recognition that our aggregates have no abiding value. But in this process of meditation, it's important that we recognize that we are developing our wisdom, our intelligence. This means we are trying to abandon this over-fixation on our aggregates, seeing them as a valid source for the attainment of happiness, whereas in reality they have no abiding value. So we're trying to let go of this one erroneous misconception, but we are not trying to replace it with the opposite erroneous misconception, whereby we come to dismiss our aggregates as having no value at all. So through the process of meditation, we need to strive to develop a balanced approach. Right now, because of our misconception, our delusion, our approach is not balanced. But we do not try and replace one extreme understanding with another. Rather, we strive to come to the balanced understanding that these aggregates have no abiding value. They cannot, they cannot lead to lasting happiness. However, by utilizing them well, putting them to good use, utilizing them well, we can achieve lasting happiness. So it's about trying to get a balanced approach between seeing that these aggregates as themselves being a source of lasting happiness, but rather recognize only through looking after them can they be put, but through looking after them, they can be put to good use. They can fulfill their purpose of the mind achieving liberation from cyclic existence. So therefore, we need to ensure that we keep a balanced approach and not just disregard our body, but that we look after it, but without attachment, without clinging. We look after it so that it can be put to good use.
예사 당하는 풍보라 착신 지교 말에 라면도 풍보리아 다부개교 말 풍보리아 낭충 그지 짜치면 지교 말에 디송교 말에 제가 착신 지교 말에서 소소기 삼다나 지교 말에서 송교도 당한도 고야라 가시게 디고야 닝아도 풍보리아 착신 지교 닝보면 요마 닝보요 닝보 대교 말라게 상 송교도 제자다 풍보리아 배지 야고요 말다디 다고자고 다시 고야요 말 선배가 삼로지요 어디 말에 제자들 디면 비금쟁아 좀 예리야 기부 충분함 일이 내가 시비가블이야 단주를 뭐소와 단주 된죠 예체와 제 단주 밀을 뭐치기 배 편연아 자치 뭐 휴지 마 송제 제자 송사르와 제자들 다디가서 기부 다디디 기부 징이람 니나서도 양도 풍보들 내다 념뭐 샤왕게 좀와 내지기 꼴배강아 되네기 기회 동아 가회 동아 나회 두어 칭에도 동아 뛰는데 여러 송거로 와 니니디 가와 말와 제자디 꼭 삼다나 가가지고 제자디 데네자 저기 류딘델에 체델이야 딘델 류딘델이야 저기 밀류림보체 딜레 하바직 저 계주님네 제발라 딜레 하바 류딘지 요말다 내가 인자 디 류딘 디데네 저 계주 주비야 탈바다 탐제 김be 고방로게 람님네 시단 류딘 델레데네 제고 거래 제가 류딘 델레데네 제고 와서 류딘 디 야고지 메나 람님네 제도 말와 곰냐네 제도 말 제가 류딘 야고 고반장 저 류딘 디 저기 최제바는 기회 냠는 줘봐 탈바다 탐제김에 고마 토발라야 류딘디 판도 균 그 판도 시우지 배제 첨부 시우지 여바 인자 디자 첨보다 데니게 자 첨부 통제 디 안에 송급제지 다고지 다고야고教야디 디도와 탈바다 탐제김에 고마 토베게 계주 주발라 판도 첨부지 통제 니체도 만도 류디 다고야고 얼마도 데니게 마통하지 안 류리야 배직 착신 유기捐야 마통 연대야 마통 다 소소 류리야 직 몽버 마리비 원기 되네 차바기 자신 게려바나 디디고 말해서 올다가지래 디제바나 디니 제바나 디기다 아저 라신니가라 동아여야다 제와 치마이나 강아체 규사고 제자 디디고 디 자신 삼당고 말 제자다 고풍부기 예수용捐디게 가르가가 여바지 다 하고 바지 하고 델레 타네 야가 가르토베 여바디 하고 바지 야가 토베 된다라 베지 땅디 풍보디 가르 야가도선 다디 풍보디 야고도스 데인자 디고도스 베게 풍보디 송급제야 다고 제야다 데니기 토네 베지 땅고 차고래서 제자 데네인자 풍비捐다捐디야 하고 바지 데네捐디다 제제 토베 딜레 야가 유비 풍보디 여바 하고 바지 디 토비에게 된다라 배주의치도 계조에 두고 거래 계조 주비에게 띠엔디 다디 류딘딜을 하고요 말에 제가 디디 류딘을 하면 제가 디네자 계조 주비에 띠엔디 계조 주비에 냠는 탈침하게 된다라 아니 저기 띠엔 풍보디 다 소소게 송급제니 면제제야다 되니게 한다고 자고도 계시 머리에서 된다 나디 차산이 차산 초 차산을 하고는 냠는 제번에 디 야보는 거래 디마도 초가지 하고捐지 하고 아다디捐지다 다고야 민도선 델리아 통신 다다 소소 류리아 안지 저 송급 맞제바제 안도 셰베네 디기 저기 타바탐지 김고 공원 람냠네 제발라 뉴고 바체 용고 디디고 말 디 노조 차고래
So trying to abandon attachment to the body does not equate to not looking after the body. Again, if that's the understanding someone comes to, then they've gone to an extreme misconception. Rather, what it means is relating to our body without the exaggeration of improper mental engagement and attachment, but seeing that this body is a required foundation for our spiritual development. It is the ideal basis for our spiritual development. So this understanding would have been cultivated previously when we were developing the foundational meditations, the preliminaries to these meditations, when meditating on the precious human rebirth. What makes this human rebirth precious is that one has the capacity, with all 18 qualities developed, to develop mental paths leading to liberation and enlightenment. This is what makes this rebirth precious. Therefore, this life, this body, is to be protected, is to be guarded, and is to be utilized well, but without the exaggeration of attachment. So independent on having trained well in the preliminary practices, the trainings that are shared with the practitioner of initial capacity, then coming here, one will be able to more clearly recognize the danger of falling into an extreme of thinking that abandoning attachment for the body means that one doesn't need to look after the body, or signs of looking after the body are signs of attachment. So that is the misconception we need to guard against. And to do so is dependent on the individual practitioner taking continuous, deep and honest reflections on whether their attitudes, their behavior is guided by attachment or not. So when looking after the body, is attachment to how one looks, is that an overriding, a dominant factor in how we care for the body or not? So the outcome through this meditation is that we come to recognize the usefulness of this body, which is that independent upon this life that we have, we can cultivate the causes that will lead to liberation. But to attain liberation, we have to abandon attachment. That certainly includes attachment to our body. So here the practitioner needs to go through an ongoing process through meditation to ensure that they are being honest with themselves and honest with others, and not dress up their attachment as Dharma practice, not to become more pretentious with others. So this is important. This process of meditation should be stripping away such pretense at being perceived in certain ways, but rather to have one's goal not on how others perceive you, but on achieving the goal of liberation for the sake of all. So this is a slow process, a process of continuing to strip away the layers of delusion. Right now we are at coarser layers, they're easier to do, but this is why one needs to engage in these meditations repeatedly over a sustained period, to strip away pretense, to strip away delusion. And the outcome is that one recognizes the great usefulness of this body, but to fulfill the usefulness of this life, attachment has to be abandoned, including to this body. And thereby, one utilizes this life well to cultivate the causes for liberation.
차상 뢰당 고래 지지 지지 뢰당 고래 뢰마다는 최하고 용마 지지 뢰당 고래 다 뢰나라 가르세다 소소 분이에도 안에 지기 소소 지 유자라 가래메다 뢰당 고래 사실 송고로 다 되네 뢰당 고래 송도 그 돈다디 될래야 착신 지교 말에 송고 뢰당 고래 착신 지교 말에 될래야 착신 제도 버이나 니 견전 용라 마보 강한 먹고 지는 아주 최념에 제발에 야고 용 말에 송고를 착신 뢰당 고래 세디 될래야 착신디 파 뢰지 파 착신 지교 말에 송고를 제산 디네 송요도 당한 줄이야 아니 다 지기 소수기 유지의 차상야 권조야 라마야 피고래 저 피고래 자지 아니 류롱제 계속해서 차상 피고래 해서지 송유도 제가 저기 내가 야고 마신 비기 냠내지도 당보 그러더라 다지 콜기 철에 닝보 요마 작성 요 말에 안지 소수기 유제다 진년유 차상 안 닝보 요 말에 세비기 파지 파 최지 딘 송유도 되네지 니 다시 되게 소수기 유제 가르는 류롱제 차상야 피고래 라 권조려 초보 라마래 피고래 세 송유도 니안고 다 될래고요 다 되니기 됐삼다도 다닝보 메바 되시기 레선베 소술에 셈려야 초슈 전부 시우지게 초슈 전부 시우지게 다방아 최냠나제 다닝보 민도 셈베 다 찾아 류긴 셈베 삼다제 되네바 안에 소수 분인이도 다자다 가제제 바 다른 무지야 당을 검제게서 좋아제 안에 소수기 유제되게 나다 고라마다 류노주 찾아라면 피고서 찾아 피 변조를 찾아 피샤 도에는 안디 마도 레 당고라 마도 티차상지 두고 말해 매어서 데니 조네 안에 가담질이야 냠네도 야고 마저도 데네 셈마 마기바차 데네 변조를 지여바디에 차상 피서 밀 피서 요 말해 내도도 소소사야도 해비제다 강아체 데네 신에 안에 셈마 마기바차 셈 뇽바차다 달 오다디 갈려 고르나샤스 주메셰샤스 네 데네 라말야 카다야 데네 최세의 민두스 미고 다야레샤 세베 두삼단의 삼로 로제네 록다게야디 냥아 침부 쉬운 거래 이 냥아 침부 용 거래 제자디 최제단이 내사디 모인니수데 가르쳐상제 이제 하고제 게 침부 쉬우자 거래 얘는 연구하래 되네
This process of reflection that I've presented here is in relation to our physical aggregate, our body. But we need to also go through the same process of reflection in relation to everything that we utilize, so our possessions, our wealth, and so forth. Because just like with our body, in terms of our possessions and our wealth and so forth, we relate to this with attachments arising from improper mental engagement, exaggerating the qualities of something, and thereby we are greatly attached to it. And from this attachment, suffering only follows for ourselves and often for others too. Here what needs to be abandoned is our attachment. This is what needs to be abandoned. And this needs to be understood clearly because it's all too easy for a misunderstanding to develop here. Thinking that I need to abandon worldly possessions, I need to abandon any wealth that I have, give it all away. And one can come to such a conclusion quite easily because we read about it in texts, we hear about it in teachings, but we need to understand what is meant here. Because in the reflection, just like on the body, with one's wealth and possessions and everything that one utilizes, one needs to come to recognize it has no abiding value in that it cannot lead to lasting happiness on its own. The more wealth one creates doesn't mean one is getting necessarily any happier. But the value that our possessions, our wealth, what we utilize, the value that it does have is that we can utilize it, just like our body, we can utilize it for the accumulation of merit in relation to the abandonment of afflictions and attainment of liberation and Buddhahood. There's value. So what we need to guard ourselves against is being overly inspired at a time when we're not ready and give everything away. When inspiration arises, when we gain some understanding that there's no abiding value in our possessions, in our wealth, but there is abiding value to utilizing them to accrue merit, we may think, then I will give everything I own to the 3 jewels and to my Lama. I'll leave my family. I won't have anything more to do with my friends. I'll just apply myself to the Dharma day and night for the rest of this life. And one will probably feel really motivated when this aspiration arises within oneself. But as beginners, this is actually an extreme. It is pushing ourselves far beyond where we are actually capable of practicing now. And the result will be that one becomes unhappy. And that unhappiness is likely to lead to one, abandoning the Lama because I acted in accordance with his teachings, and abandoning the Dharma because I was acting in accordance with the Dharma. And this is an extremely dangerous wrong view. So again, it's about having a balanced approach, knowing what it is we are trying to abandon, the mind of attachment, and being honest with ourselves about whether we are being honest in our practice or being pretentious. So just like how we need to meditate in relation to our body, so too with our possessions, and develop a clear understanding of the role attachment plays in how we relate to things, and that it is that we need to abandon, and thereby utilize our life, our possessions, in ways that will bring about the attainment of liberation.
제가 최담지 임범해 봤다지 파카테야게 내산 용어마 제가 되는자 소소 장도를 해야 될 로래 장고거래다 소소기 류론제 차상 야 라마를 푸야데 현래 진바 땅에 선배 자야디 삼로래디 땅장 다 되니기 라랭고스 때위갑라 안줄이야 소소기 뉴비기 당도 민도 소소리야 양 마음바나 냠는 제일이야 고유 고야게 튕긴디기 파 당도 민도 디파 냐야치다 디토네 소소게 강 툭툭이다 진바다야 라서바도 컨트롤 쳐부야 제바나 다 디고래 안디니 롤야 차상 푸긴 셈비게 뭐베 토네 차상 푸쇼고다 차상 푸쇼고래 데네 푸네다 장기 데네 야겔 마서 야야조데 니 마오바나 안주기 지기 파피오코반 야 니발 마서 냠네 야 첼체조데 데네 류롱제 라서바다 쳇바데 갸첼체체 푸투야다 데니게 안 정신심바 파피오코반 토는데 데네 류롱제 계속的 차상야 류차상 진바다야다 고절 푸투야데 용고래 디 장기 자리 용마다 람사 당보네 니수 고요드네 차상 제투기지 요아야 말바데 세상디 노트이 첨보셔야데 차고래 세상 데네 자디나시리 디나싱아도 곰접 신내주는 빼마서 야고 가서 캐셔연된 시우셔야도 땅아신이 두면서 몇 삼다지 곰자도 다디 시우신선 삼다지 곰자도 신내 주마도야 셈 여바차다 셈 마디와 차야 아니지 쉐 로다게게 닝아시어 세상 디스 차상파 마 충선 제지지기지기지는 야고들이 두마도 원마 제지기네마 바 당보데 야고도 용으로 선배들 깔래 하고 차그로 어디 나신 되네기 안쪽에 냠는 제발라 곧 냠는 제 신고고 내가디 가르가르 치고는 그 치고서야지 세상 우인이서 차상 규리만 하고 가지는 제디 계지 못 차고래 그래서 되네서 내다 되네리
In these meditations, we are looking at abandoning the delights of this life. And again, just like when looking at our relationship to our body, when we look at our relationship to all that surrounds us, we need to be clear-eyed, recognizing the misconception that leads to attachment, and that misconception is what we need to abandon. It doesn't mean we should not care for our body. It doesn't mean we should not utilize what is around us. Here, I want to re-emphasize something I've mentioned a number of times in the past, which is the meaning of Dharma practice. Dharma practice, or practicing the Dharma, means training your mind. It is practicing the Dharma means, it primarily means what we are doing with our mind, not what we are doing with our hands and our voice. These should be expressions of where our mind is. So we mustn't allow ourselves to be deceived by thinking, I am a Dharma practitioner because I'm doing or saying the right things. It's about training our mind, and training our mind so that the minds of the Dharma become we become habituated to them. They become the very reflection, the minds of the Dharma become a very reflection of who we are. This is how the Dharma arises within us. So in terms of relating to material possessions and wealth and so forth, certainly it's good to actually practice generosity and to give, but the emphasis in the training should be on giving mentally. Developing the wish ever more strongly to give everything to the Dharma. But this is on a mental level. So what we are doing there is developing our capacity to be able to give more on a material level. But being able to give on the mental level needs to be cultivated long before, so that the overriding wish to give materially follows much later. What we're trying to do is expand our capacity, because a skillful practitioner will always act within their capacity. So by mentally training, by training one's mind, one's capacity expands. And in terms of physically offering or engaging in turning away from the delights of this life, this needs to be done within our capacity. So mentally, we train ourselves and thereby expand our capacity. So again, as mentioned in the previous segment, this is about coming to know yourself, be honest with yourself, recognize who you are, and gain a balance between over-enthusiasm and complacency. And as one trains, our capacity shifts. What was difficult for us before becomes entirely achievable for us now, in fact becomes easy to do. But this requires an ongoing process of being honest with yourself and guarding against being over-enthusiastic or complacent. In another term, you've heard me say, probably in every session, these meditations need to be done repeatedly over a sustained period. This points to the meaning of practice or training our mind. So this word practice can be translated equally as training. Training our mind. To train our mind requires a sustained period of time where one continuously, repeatedly, over the sustained period, is training our mind. This is how one becomes habituated to the Dharma, how the minds of the Dharma become an expression of who you are. So to do this, we need to guard against this being overly enthusiastic, also guard against being complacent. So we need to develop a far-sighted attitude, recognizing that we are training for the long run, not to push ourselves too far and then end up giving up. So we need a far-sighted attitude, a broad attitude. Then we will be able to train our mind for the entire period of what remains of this life. And then we can be confident in spiritual transformation.
델레 셈슈야고 여바질이야 델레 게주 죽탕 차긴데 퉁이 직차상지 하고에는 게주 주야고래 셈슈 직북이 안다데 대시야 바디레 노트 차고래 베나도 내가 가르쳐베네래 셈슈 직북이 데페네 잘라로 껴고에는 셈슈 직북이 지고를 껴투에 갈래 하고래 델야 탑람 가라고 가와 주도 갈래 껴고 내가로 찾아 하고네 껴베나 디르와 투부라지는 말을 지 투부라게 증비나 당에 받증이 셈슈 지구제는 받지고 제세나 안에 소소 쇼야 있냐요 봐 셈슈 여바 지리야 델리아다 간스 증고도 간스 제고 선배 탑람 탑시디게 야고 지하고나 용거로 찍바로 당아서 내가 있네데 투부라게 베네데 셈슈 지부 용거 말 그래서 셈슈 여바 지리야 델리아 남주기 셰럽 안티지네 야고 디제네 균이 디차사 하고 디나싱아도 냠는 제발에 셈슈 지부 디고 말 남주기 셰럽고 거래 제사디 만주기 제사 탑시 송제 냠네 저자 기계치 뭐 저거래 배나 저기 참돼야세디 배마세 계치 뭐 휴지거로 와당데 참세 배하고래서 제사다 참돼야세디 참들에 미수다 마투바제 쿠우제 델레 참들 류기 참나 셈참세 참세디 조 참세대 가려고 그러서네 아주 샘디 뇨몽비기 산참을 파제제 사실을 마침 바지 샘디 기회초를 짱짱 쥐투바 대초 그래 지난 참세디 산참 마소나 가와 되는 바로나 뇨몽바 기구도 대되나 뇨몽 기기면도 세베 참디래다 원내데 샘디 기회 짱짱 섬 기회초를 섬 따지 뇨몽베 초를 마땅와제 까바들 참 샘게 참사 디차 그래 다 류참세 된가지 류참나 다 미스전다다 마투고 강야 마투고 구교지 구솜치 되베이나 다 류참세 책으로와 제산데 류참 제베갑라 샘참다 이가 님도 여바나 다 야고차야 돼 마도 류참 직부 되진 류참도 위해서 샘디 안직 바지고 당전에 안에 녀모바제기 자위 남면가 파다 망고 당샤베이나 되네 참디 류삼디 뒤고올 때 이내 샘디 참나 뒤고 말페니기 안에 녀모 차나께서 유차상을 봐 당샤로 봐 제가 샘삼디 리고 말에 디잉아 주기 줄디 야고용 두고 말에 전에 참 샘디 참 기위 초서 되지 녀모서 마다와제 참디 마투바이나 류지부니 임발에 되지 안지 미션나나 마트 수지마 되베네 대 명디 나한주기 전가세 민다고 말때 이내 지바라와 그래서네 디 치료를 드라마저 소수기다 디 담냐다기 자신 삼노디기 바가샤로와 당 전가네 치료 드라마 줘버디 다 년도be 가고로와 디나시 지바레마도 아니 샤라샤 판도시야 유민도와 제선다 고에 쪼디나 당주기 샘삼다 류삼 이게 니가 님도 요토바이나 다지 야고는 거로와
So much of what I'm emphasizing here is the need to develop your intelligence, which comes about through repeatedly over a sustained period, going through reasoning. Applying reasons, as presented in all these meditations, is about developing a deep intellectual basis for what we do, who we are becoming. What we're trying to guard against is by following our emotions, because that if we're following our emotions, we are not using our reasoning. Whereas if one is using one's intelligence, one is much more likely to make a better decision than if one is inspired and strong emotion arises, and one makes a big decision based on that. So we can think of illustrations. For example, if you are inspired to have a good-looking body, so you go to a gym, and now with your inspiration, you start lifting weights which are far too heavy for you, it's not going to go so well, because your enthusiasm, your emotion, overtook you. You weren't using your intelligence, thinking about, well, my capacity is at this level, I need to train in the way that I'm being advised, and then I'll be fine. But we end up hurting ourselves. Or if a soldier in warfare, if their predominant quality is being brave, but they lack the developed skill of warfare, they are going to die very quickly because they'll put themselves in an overly dangerous situation. But if they have intelligence as well as bravery, then it will go much better. Where this is so important is also to guard against a very common misconception about retreat. Retreat, engaging in retreat, we know is of great importance. The texts emphasize this. We hear stories about great practitioners living alone in the wilderness, and we gain great inspiration from this, wanting to emulate them. But being guided by our emotions, if we follow them, we will make a mistake, because we haven't come to intellectually understand what is even meant by retreat. This English word retreat literally is the word for boundary or for a border between nations. So the border between nations, this is the word for retreat. And it can, in the context of retreat, can also be translated as isolation, in that retreat has the components of physical isolation and mental isolation. So one sets up a physical boundary, that this is where I'm going to do retreat. So this is how one physically isolates oneself from the hustle and bustle of daily life. And then there's the component of mental isolation, where one mentally withdraws oneself from the afflictions. And this is all too often missed if someone is emotionally driven to enter into retreat. They sit there with their afflictions present. And then they're actually no different from a prisoner in solitary confinement. A prisoner in solitary confinement is actually not so different from someone in an isolated place up in the mountains, in that no one is around them. They maybe have someone attending on them, bringing them food from time to time, but that's it. But no one will say a prisoner in solitary confinement is in retreat, because their mind is not isolated. So the process of retreat is primarily isolating the mind, or separating the mind from the afflictions. Less so about separating the body. This is beneficial, but what is of greatest importance is separating the mind from the afflictions. To be able to do that doesn't require going off somewhere into isolation. It requires extensive training beforehand in separating one's mind from being dominated by the afflictions. So in this way, I hope it's becoming clearer the need to engage in these meditations, to develop one's intelligence through reasoning, so that one's decisions are reliable and not based on emotion.
Bendigo de oda ko samdyo arse samdyo de koronge ma jandala nga jinge dile chi ro chi ni chi ro chi jena e khamba ja de dene chi diwa dona tu go de le ga cha du da samlo di gewe samma to de da di le ga di je go di go je de samda de go wa samda je oda di je go do da di sul la go do ko lam ya go so ko che sa de du shen samda le ga le de go wa da chi sa su bu di nga de chamna samdi 제가 샘데 참날 뒤투고 샘 안주게 참시도 샘디 계획 쇼도 다데 남미의 추수 마다와지 안에 지금 되고 디디어 마도디 제가 다 제세도 미고 참디야 야고레스 라고와 다 참디야 이네 샘기 참디어 마도디 안 샘데 남미의 철파 다진 차단제 율 다제 되는 용거로 와다 되니기 제가 되니 자당 제가 샘 참디다 아주 게디네 가와 조베네 더 가와 되베네 소수기 삼로디 개비 철파 그 양내한테 삼다다 녀몽베 제일파 양신에서 가동체에 두신의 삼다베나 다 네엠벌 되나다 정세나를 되바나 안에 그 공바자 조베네 되는시베네 샘디 삼날 이거다 샘디 삼도 녀몽베기 산삼로 제지 개비 산삼로 제지 녀몽파 마다와제 남이알파 마다베네 다 돈다 엄마라 다 참디고서 민디 따고 말가지 지솔 민디 따고 마디 이내나 돈다라 샘디 아니 녀모 쳐서 마다와 개위 섬나로 두 니디디 다 산살마선다 소수게 사진하라 뒤고다 실로긴 두고 마시다 샘참 참로 최고르데 네 데니 이제 돼야 되다 계치셔대 뒤로다 하죠.
It can happen all too easily that strong emotional yearning arises. I want to go in retreat. I want to live somewhere isolated, somewhere quiet, so I can apply myself to the Dharma practice like all the great practitioners of the past. Now, the strong emotion arises, and then what does the person do? They start looking for a property to buy. Then they start planning in their mind how they're going to build it. Maybe they find the property and they can afford it. Then they start the whole process of building the ideal retreat place that ticks all the boxes. But what is guiding them? It is primarily attachment. Attachment to being seen in a certain way. Attachment to seeing oneself in a certain way. The prior training of abandoning the afflictions, that has not been done sufficiently well. So even if they see their project through to the end, and they enter into retreat, the desired goal is not going to come about, because the preliminary practice of abandoning the afflictions, of dealing with the mind well, being skilled in the mind, of coming to know one's own mind well, that has not been done. And then going into retreat too soon, it will overwhelm one eventually. One will not be able to continue, and one may well end up abandoning one's entire Dharma practice, feeling insufficient, inadequate. But the mistake that was made is that one didn't follow the required prerequisite trainings. And the trainings just come down to this: keeping one's mind on virtue all day and all night, and away from non-virtue, away from the afflictions. And by doing this, both in formal meditation in our daily practice, as well as trying to take that into our daily life, keep the mind virtuous, keep the mind away from the afflictions, we are developing the skill so that eventually one can go into retreat, isolated retreat, long-term retreat. But if one does so too soon, one will not achieve one's final goal. And really, of the two, being physically isolated somewhere, or isolating one's mind from the afflictions, there is no comparison over what is more important. So therefore, for the vast majority of practitioners, staying within community, staying with one's home, with one's family and community, but training one's mind, developing this foundation, this is where one's time and energy should be put, rather than into fantasies about going off into the mountains.
Yeah. That's the understanding that my Jimalo was among what a treasure in which has on the Shuzi that in Maluvina.
So sorry about that. I've been talking for an hour already, but now we'll turn to the text. But I hope the general point of what we're looking at here is very clear, as well as how to do these, why and how to do the meditations.
Nan de le yula longe ba nyamsu nyamba sai longe nyamba da de tang ju da kang ga ga gyun ga de yong go le se di shi yula longe nyamba ni sa dong so ju ga xin ne xian du nam la longe ba mini ba was.
So turning to the text, page 159 and 3/4 of the way down, the suffering of aging, of which we saw has 5 points. So now we come to the 4th. The enjoyment of sense objects declines. Food and drink become difficult to digest, and you can no longer enjoy other pleasures.
Anda didu ngonju donda siktige de lo ne ma ho ska mindu da diru wa chi da donda la ngdo sa dong so nyam ba ju kwa shi si de ga je le ngonju gi pa lu di ba nyam do zhe du ne kala ro ka sa be ne de ji ne yong an ma do pen ye de ne gi ju ka wa se dis wo pen le che ra ju ju ma do ba ban ka re che na ji ma che ba ne yong ra che cha go ro wa ju ka shi de ne xian duyun la long ju ba minu ba xian duyun si da ngang ju ge xian da ji ge zemo ze ya dang ga re chao ya da de ni ge ji je long ju na lu nyam yo de ni de ni je tu yo ma re che sa de ni ge nyam ba re che sa di ga sin lu ge to nyam je da lu ge ba gyun de se o da.
What Lama Tsongkhapa has written is really quite clear. And this is also something that as we age, we can see within ourselves. The enjoyment of sense objects decline. So our taste, as we saw in the previous point, our sense faculties all decline. Therefore, the pleasure we take from sense objects declines. For example, we struggle to hear the subtler notes in music that we once enjoyed and therefore cannot gain the same pleasure. Or our sense of taste, that also declines. But also in terms of our body's capacity to utilize the nutrition in food, this also declines. So this speeds our physical weakening. And likewise, we know when we age, we need to exercise. But the strength of our body is declining, making it difficult for us to exercise and maintain our strength.
아네 대대서 류기 네 다야 체용수 년비기 동안이 네 체팔지 세배 치와라 초바데 내남 야나야도 셈바오스.
That was the fourth, and then the fifth. When the lifespan deteriorates completely, you suffer because your lifespan largely spent, you face death.
대사당은 저기 지금만 경고 창의도 다시엘이야 체리마 직마 세는 바시엘이야 다른 교교래도 되는 소소나 어다니 직나 시조서가 강아 체세선 비게 삼론할 야네 야들이 셈마기와 중고레스 저 디스고라 대지의 개비 동 여비기 견제스 개비기 이용고레스.
Through this process of aging, one is not only experiencing the suffering related to one's physical, mental decline, but also through the recognition that most of one's life has passed, that the time that has passed exceeds the time that remains, and that death is now approaching, and that the arc of one's life is nearing completion.
아니네 자단 쟁업이 계시 쟁업이 현에 가르쳐 버렸으네 치유 동안 투대 윤통 개반디 디가 투 송어사.
Now, Lama Tsongkhapa quotes some Kadampa teachers. Think about these points again and again. Chenghua said, the suffering of death is vicious but brief. The aging process is just vicious.
지상당 중에 치비기 다 치비 동화 투대 윤통통세 뒤통로실이야 리고레서 제사디 개반 네가 투 송어스다 경고 차도 신 그런 나하라 데니실이 용고레스 제사디 림바투 신의 개개 둘레다디 시에 괜찮은 뒤통로제 시세 우체 봐서면 다다하나 지차용으로 데니기 뒤통로 통로실이고레서 도나지래도.
When death comes, no matter how one dies, it always comes in the same way, in that there is one final exhalation and this life is complete. So it always ends in this one point. But the process of aging, this gradual decline, this is so vicious because one is witnessing what is happening to oneself, and one is powerless. There's nothing that can be done to sustain one's life or to sustain one's strength or attractiveness. This just is declining, and one has to bear with this. And the second quote is from the Kadampa teacher Karmapa. It is good that old age comes gradually. If it came all at once, it would be unbearable. The process of death and aging are quite different, in that aging is the gradual decline leading towards the completion, the culmination of this life, the ending of this life. But old age tends to come quietly. It's more deceitful. Slowly, day by day, change is happening unnoticed until one suddenly does. And then we recognize how much of this life has ended, how little remains.
두스 갱고를 betting 통고를 된 치조바데 통고를 되네 안에 가서 그냥 되지 녀리야 기부 충유 남기는 변이야 쉐비가블 시소나 매바 책 말에 신이 매바 말로 깨와질린 거래 다 깨와 렘바들 가와린 것은 만도다 된더니 마도 깨와래요 말에 지산 된더 깨와래디 깨와 두고래 깨와 마도바지 미개와 제반은 안도 깨와린 거래 에세지 디 삼로디야 하고 거다 되래 녀마다 되지 녀샤데 기부 충우의 투모와 남유림비 가서 쉐리 냠는디게 디가서야 냠소 랭고를 삼 땅고래 세디디래 지산 디니게 개비 동아 삼 땅에도 오다 개와 차나 시투고 치러나 매바 차가 매나 매와 맞춰봐서 개와실랭 개왔나 야네 덴도 개와야는 안도 개와랭고래 지산 덴도 개와 랭고에서 탈바 탐지 김고 고바도베 람 탈바 고바 토발라 덴도 개와지 매바나데 뒤딘디 데니시 매반다 탈바 고바 냠는데 투사 말 저 탈바 토발라 덴도 냠는 기와 랭고도 와서 베게 데니가 하고 왜 토네 다디가 저거라서나 두치네 삼 하고 하지 데니 하고네 데니기 토네다 가바세 다든가 개바 라바다 와셔봐 다 데니시도 다디 개바데 간에 차고라서네 로리다 다와 로네 다와네 아니 지 샤네 차라지도 끼지끼지끼지 막 유르제 개로 거다 누구야 삼다도 끼지끼지는 유네 개로 봐요 토르도 재산 가위기 네디 고 끼지끼지는 유르제 찍찍을 둘데 도도와 삼백에 네수도 하고도 단닝보 민도 삼백 되네게 하고요 재산다 냠네 제야디야 다 끼지끼지는 유시에라 타년여도도 류디된을 개위 냠는 제바네 다다네 마체베 이네다 제마지고 삼되면 끼지끼지 균도 조로도 왔어 지난 시에라 타년년에도 제가 개위 냠는 제야데 네 집에 용사 막 재산 개위 냠는 다다네 제고도 삼베 삼로들이 두고 왔다 가지래 나디래 지난 데니기 가위 동아디 파도 제 삼단에 다 가와데 데네 가와서도 그냥 아주 롱아마다 다데 있는 롱 로디 개체와를 로니마디 되셔 말이오래서 삼단 단 로직 나로 삼다바나 다와 당부 로디 시험 봐제 딜래야 니니세도 중요 받을래들 개라 차도 와서 다와레세 단데네게 니멀 삼바나 쇼게드마 고다바도 삼다 다 주지질 삼바나 가마 당번 마 또스네 깨지깨지 닝제 둘둘둘두고 통해도 오다 데네 개회 냠는제도 다데나 맞는 지금도 집에 최신의 다다니도 제세야 되래다 데네게 니서 통해도 암산 최제 냠는데 기디 내다 최제에게 삼로도 코라지 가선 깨워지마 덴주의 덴 탈바 탐지 김보 고바토에 탈비 고바토에 덴 냠는지 고고에서 덴디 토에도 나라 근데 개회 냠는데 다데네 제야다 안 탈비 고바토에게 냠는데 덴들 맞아봐 있는다 조런다 제가 고브라미도 하신 배 다디 덴들 제고 선배 되니 탈비 고바토에 람 냠는 제 다데네 제고 선배게 냠는 제 셈슈를 마소나 셈슈디 디와야다 듬발해야돼 대용거. 근데 듬발돼 심지어 봐이나 되게 냠내줘야지. 그디네 난 냠내줘야고 고합시라고. 던달라 디레다 가위 둥아 셰비게 금세 셰고 베게 금세디 가르스나 디파 끼지끼지 지바 통용도 다 끼지끼지 지바 루이텔라 되게 지용도 제사다 개위 냠내다 타고 토베게 냠내데 다데네 마제바 이네다 되네 유르고 되네 고합디 용용 루도와 선배삼다 코르제 개위 냠내 탈바토에 탈바 고바토에 니 람냠는 제야디 다데네 지네 기주 주비알이야 두스네 셈슈케야 데 듬버케야게 된다지리다.
This process on the suffering of aging, it's very easy to understand. Just read the title and one knows that this is correct. Likewise with previously when you looked at the suffering of birth. And if one reads the 5 subpoints, then again, it's very easy to understand. So many topics in the Dharma, on a course level, we can understand without any effort. But that level of understanding does not lead to much transformation. The way to bring about transformation is to meditate in the way described, on each point in the correct sequence, in detail, leading to transformation. And whilst the various topics of the Dharma are presented as one chapter after the other, each preceding chapter adds to the quality of realization of the later chapter. So what is clear here is that meditating on suffering, in this case the suffering of aging, is greatly enhanced by one's prior meditation on precious human rebirth and its impermanence, as well as when the impermanence, it culminates in death, rebirth follows. And that rebirth is determined by one's karma. Either one remains in the higher realms or falls to the lower realms. So these are the meditations that are the foundations to what we are brought here. And thereby, in dependence on those meditations, one already has a basis to build on, something that can lead to a greater degree of determination, recognizing the changing process, the impermanence of our current situation. So I spoke about this last night, and we spoke about this in some detail last year. So in this meditation here on aging, we recognize how over this course of this life, so much change has come. And then we think about the time ahead of us, probably less than has already passed. And that this is a process of continuous change from the past to now, and from now until the culmination of this life. And then so we've looked at the past, we've looked at the future, and now we bring it closer. So from, let's say, how we imagine things will be in 10 years' time, how we imagine they'll be in 5 years' time, 1 year's time, and then we bring it down to how they may be later in this year, how they may be next week, and how things are today. And we come to recognize this process of ongoing continuous change, that we may relate to things as being static, but they're changing immediately, every moment. So we look at the day, how much we divide our day into parts, and we recognize each part of the day also ends. Our morning is done, for example. And within the parts of the day, there are smaller parts. For example, the part that is this teaching time together. This is approaching its end, and then it's finished, never to be repeated again. With that comes the understanding that the opportunity that this period has presented will then be completed. And that opportunity to cultivate minds of the Dharma will be completed. Likewise, with a meditation session, when that time is done, it is done. That opportunity is now finished. It is impermanent. So we take this reflection, in this case on aging, to recognize this process of change, this process of impermanence. And this comes about our understanding is aided by our prior reflections on the preliminary practices, which are the trainings that are shared with a practitioner of initial capacity. Where the outcome of these meditations is a growing strength of mind, determined attitude, one that's not based on emotion but based on reason, that I must apply myself to cultivating the minds of the Dharma. All the other things, the pleasures of this life, the problems of this life, they are not important. They too are changing. They have no abiding value. What has value is strengthening my habituation to virtuous minds. So this is how we develop an even deeper determination to abandon non-virtue, to accumulate virtue, to utilize what remains of this life well.
로직이 빨아를 경고 잡아든 거 하고 두고 그래. 다와 가시게 빨아지 하고 두고 그래. 근데 다와지다 다와니 빨아를 경고 잡아디 제라 하고 두고 말해. 이미지 나로를 경고 쇼에당 아원이 경고 잡아데 델레니 찌부찌게 당한 줄 알았으면 가사다 디링이 찌부찌게 삼 진주고 그래. 디 따선해야 돼. 찌 교원 매번 찌바 삼다 따선해. 제가 당한 쪽에 쇼에는 공타 받아 빨아들이야 유어 줘봐도 기네 하고 두고 제가 직발에서 직발한 진주. 세상 까차 레리를 주어 두고 받은 가서 하고 거 말. 세상 디도 신에 로직이 gyuwa ting az gengwa chaba da hago gore ma do dawa ji na shaba ha she de ni ji na lo gyuwa zhuo ge ba gyuwa gengwa cha ge ba ting az hago go ma se da du chi ne 파 심주 제바 삼당이 땡이 제바 있는 기지 를 유어줘 봐 기지 직파 아니 경고 개바디 개 차와다 하고 연도 신의 sem을 초와리고 다디 마진의 직도 어딘자 개와다 다든 두고서 비게 삼노데 리고래 되네 자당 지금 두세네 디기 다 고와서 많이 봐도 심주 제바 제와디 다 개치 못 제와 지나다 만주기 두세네 네 제공제에 배계치 못 차고래.
So again, the suffering of birth, which we concluded looking at, and now the suffering of aging, which we are concluding to look at, as well as what will still follow. As I said a few moments before, these are very easy to understand. But if you want the Dharma to transform your mind, to arise within you in a way that is sustained, one must go beyond a mere acceptance of, yes, I understand, I know that, I'm now ready for the higher trainings. One needs to go beyond that and spend the time in a sustained manner, transforming our way of thinking through doing these meditations. Because with the suffering of aging, we can read this and understand it. And with the looking at the impermanence of this life, we can understand that in just a moment. I see how I've changed from when I was younger to now, and I can imagine how I'm going to change between now and whenever my death comes. There, understood. But nothing has changed within inside. There's no sustained change in terms of striving in the Dharma. One needs to break this down, looking at the suffering of aging, break this life down into periods, recognizing as a starting point what has already changed and what we expect to change in the future. But recognize that actually next year will be different from today. Next month will be different from today. Tomorrow will be different from today. And this is now where it will get more difficult, because we have this natural grasping at permanence, that we relate to things as being unchanging when they are actually changing, and they are changing momentarily. It's not just the momentary change, but even coarser levels that are hidden to us. The way we relate to our body, to our life, to our possessions, is that from yesterday to today, they are the same. And it's only when something big happens that we recognize that, say, our health is different today from yesterday. But the reality is, our body is changing momentarily. This is what we need to come to recognize. And this we do not get immediately. Of course, understanding is not difficult. Anyone can understand that. But for the Dharma to arise in a sustained manner, we need to understand subtle impermanence. This understanding leads to a far more transformative attitude to transform our life, to utilize our life well.
안에네 먼저 나위 동아 세야되래단 나위 동아 숨바 나위 동아 삼발랑아 류기 라신 유아니 류기 샤슈 마 빠빠 감바 소소스.
That then completes looking at 2 of the 8 sufferings. Now to the 3rd at the top of page 160, the suffering of illness. As previously, the contemplation on the suffering of illness has 5 points. The first of the 5, the nature of the body changes in that the flesh becomes loose, the skin dries up, and so forth.
And the Gargu was Carson Luigi, Shediki Pat, nearly to Yawara Huvene, then Nayan to Subo Kambocha, Shuni, Kambocha, then Baba de Gepa, Dang Meva, Kambo, to Shen Chayala Soba, and the Nigi, Yungore says that is so, and to get most of Toyagi, Sebu ever read that to Mixi, Sherate Shika, Mido.
When illness strikes, there is an immediate, an apparent, a visible change to the body. One's physical and mental strength fades away. If one's ill for a while, one's body will wither away. So one loses one's strength, and one's body also fades away. And one becomes weak, and it becomes difficult just to sustain oneself, just to do basic things around the home. And one is left just enduring one's pain as one's body wastes away.
Dunga da yi mi diwa peshin dela she shir neba ni lu yu chula so bige kam nam chan minyan bar she che chung du chukbe lu la dunga kishin di semla mi diwa kebe ninsen dagwe bawos.
The second of the 5 points. Suffering and mental unhappiness increase such that you dwell in them most of the time. The bodily constituents, water and so forth, become unbalanced and fluctuate widely in strength, producing pain in the body. That in turn causes unhappiness in the mind, both day and night.
Say you da me junwa la soba pa nyam ro du so so le semlia ane ka so re kamnam chaminya ba se du 중함 감시디 바 참미냐 바 자루고로 참미냐 바 전에 시춘 가브리엘이야 추 감시 쳐와 가브리엘 매 감시 쳐와 제도 근데 되네게 투 류리야 참미냐 바 쳐야 아주 수보나리아 중시기 감디 찬냠바 찍바 약고시되도 때 수보되고체 다 참미냐 바 쳐야도 근데 수보래 나의 강아체야 돼 자긴 서로가 제자 되네자 참미냐 투요도 갈로 안 가르스네 다 이게 류리안 나자 단 동화제도 초와 동화도 기용 그래서 동화 기진 셈 미디어인데 셈 마기와체 미디어지 지산 셈 마기와 기디나 오다 셈 마기와지 이 날에 새 날에 도시는 셈 마기와지 되고 그래야지.
So first, just to say as an aside, as the translator, translated here, this term translated as mental unhappiness is the same term that's been coming up on the Wednesday classes. I've been translating as discontent or displeasure. So, and that this is what precedes, in the context of the Wednesday class, precedes anger. So now reading from the text, suffering and mental unhappiness increase such that you dwell in them most of the time. The bodily constituents, water and so forth, become unbalanced and fluctuate widely in strength, producing pain in the body. So when the elements that comprise the body is comprised of water, fire, wind, and energy. When these go out of balance, this is when illness befalls us. When they are in balance, then we have our strength, we have our luster, and we are in good health. But when they are out of balance, this is then when illness befalls us. And when illness befalls us, then the mind becomes unhappy, so mental unhappiness, which leads to suffering arising. So in this way, when our body is out of balance, our mind suffers. Then the third, you lack the wish to enjoy pleasant things. You are told that pleasant things are harmful when you are ill, so you are not free to indulge in them as you wish. Thus, you cannot do whatever you want. So this we recognize when we're ill. We lose our freedom to do things that we want to do because we're ill, or to enjoy things we want to otherwise enjoy because we are ill. Moreover, even if we can do something, our wish to do so may also go because of our mind being unhappy.
네, 지상 진행나 주연줄이야 개심보다 신도야 或신보되게네 지금 사야게 되고 연한 사야만 되기는 뒤로서
So, for example, like myself with diabetes, I can't enjoy the delights of Australian baking because I cannot eat things with sugar.
다 다양 유기스 롱지 이도 묘와라 미디신도 제거반에 맨다 사동소 이도 묘와 nengi jie gui xin, de xin du mi sewa cun ji bu ba so ji zu bo nam ding go ba wo se.
Then the fourth, you must undergo the unpleasant against your will. You must ingest unpleasant medicine, food, drink, and so forth. Likewise, you must rely on rough tests and treatments such as being burnt with fire, pierced with sharp instruments, and the like.
되네 자다 소소게 자에게 되버 매바이네 다 인지미지대 사고가 차고로 그래서 근데 아주 맨로지메 지게 되게 사에 되버 매바네 다 맨디게다 마사바는 대시도 그래 삼제 되네기 이제 맨지게 매주체화 사고야라서 봐다 야지 소소게 소불량 마셔야다 되네기 제 뚝제게 되어 매나야 나디 내를 자에게 돈달이야 아니 되게 수벌이야 지게 두야라 소바다 되니게 마셔야라 소바지야 되네 미 세바 천유 부바 소다 가브리아가 저기 매 자초선 수벌에 자야라 소바다 되니게 면제제 연구로 되네 천유 부바 세되다 맞아 갑자다 샤셔 땅에도 지금으로 되니게 다 제비릭되게 소소되어요 말되네 제고샤고를 그래서네 디 소소리아 내나서기 긴기디 제고로 왔어. 그래서 제 미디어반이 내한테 제고야 자고로 와서.
You must undergo the unpleasant against your will. You must ingest unpleasant medicine, food, drink, and so forth. So when one's ill, one does things that one would otherwise not choose to do. For example, one may take natural compounds, herbal medicine, some of which just tastes awful. But you do so, you endure so because you want to heal. Or you need to engage in difficult medical treatment, which perhaps surgery or other invasive treatments, which are unpleasant and the recovery from which can be quite painful and protracted. But one does so anyway to try and recover from severe illness. And the fifth, where am I here? 4, 5. You will lose your life. You will lose your life. You suffer on seeing that the illness is incurable.
제사당한 중에 내 나서를 제대 다직 내디 강아 제제 파 시설에 선배 섬 되니기 통역도 괜찮어도 되네야 셈이야 동아로지 동아 용거레스 제상 두신에 다 10도 3보시데 다데데세데 라바라바레 두신에 디시셰바 나지 두신에 유단 대소 차상 영화의 유단 갱가를 때는 용구도 가능가는 용구도 두시 심주시 두신 80초제 3당고레스 월
The fifth point, maybe the sentences should be in opposite order, that'd be more correct. That when one is suffering from severe illness and one recognizes that it's incurable, then the suffering is enhanced in that one knows the end of one's life is nearing. So all of these 5 points here, we recognize that they come about independent on causes. It's not bad luck, it's not misfortune, it's independence on causes. Suffering results such as these will inevitably follow.
제사다도 신내당 주대지 그신 시바나 신대 기회 동아 되네 용고에서 기회 동아 남자 몽보듯이 내가 기회 동아 남자 몽보듯이 되네 안지게 나의 동아 되게 되네 열에서 어두 신에 시에도 되네 되네 율라롱 제 미디비 동아다 되네기 두신의 익되네 수용 제시다 두신의 삼다에 대해서 간의 용고에서 바 심주치네 네 게디 용고에서 배쳐봐나 대시 셰바나 지가도 게지게지게지네 용고에서 되네기 삼다나 직체 다 삼다 직리야 안데 직 대해서 가르치는 용고에서 세상 풍보디를 되는 용고래. 그래서 풍보디 맨나 기회 동안 세계대 영화요 말에 지나다 가위 동안에 영화요 말 나위 동안에 용고 말. 세상 깨와단 가와단 나위 동안 차상 풍보디를 되는 용고도 와. 그래서 풍보디 교인되는 시에샤 당한주 풍보는 미는 아주 제바진데 풍보디 세상 교인되는 시 풍보디를 되는 용고도 풍보디다 가와다 나와다 안에지기 기회 동안 차상 용사기 띵조 델레티는 용고도 네디 디레도 와 선비게 삼다디레 제사디 용고에서 제사디 용자 디 풍보때는 용고에서 디 풍보때 가르치는 용고에서 비 삼다디 디 뭐콜라 되는시 괜지 되는시 용고를 걸 가르치는 그런 게다 되는 용어에도 그런 신이로 차도 그런 풍보때 유친실라 되는디 동아디게 강아디게 용하야지 임발이다. 가르치는 그런 게 뭐라 되는지 차대로 와. 되는 자다 안 풍보때 용어에도 김자 가르에서 세상 풍보때 유레 녀모바 녀모 온기리 봐 차리. 세상에 녀모베기 제보들라 되는시마도 다 야고셔야 말했어. 세상에 풍보때 다 세상 그런 끼지끼지 유어진 루시 용거를 되는 풍보때 유디 녀모 온기 봐래. 유 레다 녀모바 녀모에 레서 레레 녀모발에 되는 끼리 봐래. 세상 유 그런 녀모바 온기 봐래. 녀모 온기 봐 인자 다 콜야 아니 그런 끼지끼지만 인규르체 직둘둘둘 조지네 되네 강아디게 차서 영야디 되네 용도 와 선비 세상 풍보디 유권에 삼다네 녀모 온기 봐 인보 메디 봐고 대대 내가 브란신이 내가 비 삼다베네 그런 교인되는 셔데 인보 메디 봐 도시는 삼당 거래서 다 십도 삼바다세야 돼 도시는 삼다야 돼서
And the three of the 8 points we've covered already, the suffering of birth, aging, and illness. There are two key parts in the meditations. First is to look at this process of momentary change so as to challenge our grasping at permanence, to recognize that our aggregates are in a constant process of change. Again, as mentioned in relation to the previous point, we think yesterday and today everything's the same, unless something unexpected happens. But the reality is our aggregates are changing momentarily. So this is something we need to recognize, and then one can do so in the way described, through looking at time periods, also through looking at a dependency on causes, in that illness, aging, certainly birth, all comes about in dependence on causes. So there's a process of change, of evolution, between the accumulation of a cause and the ripening of a result. So this is a further way to recognize that this process is one of changing, not of being static, that there are causes awaiting their ripening conditions, and they will ripen in suffering. This leads into the second key point. The first was momentary change, and the second is that suffering will necessarily be experienced by all of us due to our aggregates being contaminated. Or to express this more clearly, suffering, which is a result, follows in dependence on causes, namely that these aggregates are contaminated. And these aggregates are contaminated because they were accumulated by the afflictions. So the aggregates are the ripening of karmic imprints, which are contaminated because they were accumulated by the afflictions. And their ripening conditions include the afflictions. Hence, suffering will naturally follow. So in this second point, the first was momentary change. Now in the second point, we look at this causal process. We recognize that suffering is the very natural state of all phenomena that is bound in samsara. And why? Because the causes of all phenomena bound in samsara are the afflictions. So here, there are several key recognitions. One, that the sufferings of birth, aging, and illness is not someone's misfortune or bad luck. This is the very nature of a samsaric existence. There is no abiding value of anything in samsara. Suffering will naturally follow. The reality of our situation is, even when we're sitting here and life seems great, our situation is changing momentarily, leading towards the experience of course suffering once again. This just is the state of ordinary beings. So this is bringing these two together, momentary change, and that our physical and aggregates are in the nature, are naturally subject to suffering, leading to the result that as all unwanted results come from the cause of the afflictions, and we are in this process of momentary change, these afflictions, and therefore we will continue to experience ongoing suffering. I need to break this cycle, gain freedom from this cycle.
Na denegi andu shine samdaya degi garing gore sena du shine ta nganzo she de rapa digi kewa da kawa da nawa di rapa digi she rapa di du shine hago di nganzo ge rapa di ngeba anzo tempo hago du gore dela tene da ya samne cha samne kichi ba du she samdaya du meta pe ko samdaya gore denegi jeba che dene meta ba ndoyagi 팽거래 안디 마세 다 되니게 풍보셔야지 제사당 안저 가와다 나와다 깨제 나요도 디안진 뭐부 채우고 그래 치견 채우고 그러와 치견을 되네요 치견이 예바 점비 나그래서 나게 말해 제사 류코라 하신데라 닝보메바 차인자 나고라스 베이다 류 나와디 치견을 되바체 대 난기게 그런 유 녀모발레테네 깨와디 규교제 제사다 아주 가와다 깨와다 가와다 나와다 치와디에 가르스는 아주 풍보텔레테네 용을 풍보레 땜바 때네 용거 봐 아주 리 풍보 아주 그 풍보디 수기 풍보디 아니 유 레다 녀모발레테네 깨와레서 디네스도 윤지게 남샤 땡지게 남샤 라바라바디기 바제 하고 그래 제가 디네게 sometimes 디네게 제바치도 아주 다 가르하고 고데스네 델야 기지기 집에 미다베 남자 하고요도 지 다생이 삼로도 슈충도 오래 미다섬 다zen 제사다 되네게 두시네 다 나야다 가와나 지지당 풍벌에 뛰네 기기도 풍벌이야 돼야 아니 그런 어디 되네 용과 되어서 규단 기 녀모발에 뛰네 용도 습에 지도 윤지기 땡지기 남샤디 자바티 두시나 하고 그래 제사 되네게 하고요도 윤지기 땡지기 남자 하고 하고 미다비 남자들 야고 하거든 다음에 봐또 동반이 또 발이야 싫어 타니 주고래 진짜 동반이 또 봐 타니 줘도 좋아서 진짜 녀모베 녀보 동반이 또 베셔럽게라 타니 주고서 산제 타바다 탐지기 먹고 보토발 타니 주고로 진짜 니네게 삼다데 가지고 두시네 다 타바다 탐지기 먹고 보토스야디 직 저기 도도지 마 레스케 가나질 소수기 삼문나래야 삼로기 된치도 삼로기 되네에도 땅여도 다 소수기 삼로 녀모베 삼로도 파슈 충을 땅다 나야들이 땅제디 사본나 제바 제만의 균에 예며 사본이며 제바 가는도 매바 쇠투여도 나 소소 삼로 땅이 매바 쇠여도 된 탈바토고 제거로 제가 누시 삼다베다 아주 누시는 다들 가상 깨와다 가와다 나이베 동도 삼다 라바디에서 디하고네 델야 차차라 삼다이도 니기지 지비기 미다베 남샤데 하고야라 타녀야 줘야다 디하고요도 니지 다선도야 되네게다 아직 풍분 나야디게 풍벌에 뛰는 용도 풍보디 아니 그 녀모발에 뛰는 깨와들에 뛰는 용도 삼다 삼다이도 되네게 뛰는게 남샤시제 다음에 또 발라 타니 주고 제가 되네자 난주게디 고 망실 마소나 되네게 롭존 제요도 직 미다바다 다음에봐 되는 녀모베 다음에봐 또 별로 타녀도 녀모베 녀모 제라 타녀로 지내자다 녀모 녀모저 타르도 소소 녀모 빵발라 타녀로 디도 저도 자치미죠 토요라 타녀로 와 지난도 도시나 삼다데 베마세다 예침보지나 된다 침보지 쇼슈여네 다 상이 손바래 되네 마 제르미치 되마 삼다나도 도시 방디지 또 손제 베마세기다 야고 쇼지레도 하다가 되게 만족이다 되네게 냠나체 마토와 마도 제도나 배하고 차도록 제자디 다디기 라과라과데 삼단 도시나 삼단 고고래서 그러다.
So I encourage you to engage in these meditations, meditating, because again, what we need to guard ourselves against is this delusion that thinks, I understand this, I've got it, I'm ready for the higher teachings. In this way, one wastes one's opportunity. One doesn't achieve one's potential. So I've spoken about how to do each of these three meditations that we've looked at so far. So I encourage you to go deeper. There are two general outcomes to strive to get to. The first is a deeper understanding of impermanence. Everyone's got a coarse understanding of impermanence, but this is insufficient for the change we hope to bring. We need to get a far subtler understanding of impermanence. Why? So as to challenge our grasping at permanence. Because it's through grasping at things as being unchanging that we suffer so. We are so surprised when something breaks, when a situation changes, a relationship changes, and so forth. But the reality is phenomena are changing momentarily. And this we need to recognize. One recognizes it, as with all these realizations, first on a course level in teachings, then slowly through continued meditation at a subtler level. In particular, when one then keeps that meditation alive in one's daily life, then it starts to impact how we relate to the events of our daily life. So the first outcome to come to is that there's understanding of subtle impermanence. The second, which is related, is that of developing a deeper understanding of dependent arising. So these two are very related, but the understanding of impermanence is referring to momentary change. Dependent arising, here we talk about dependency on causes. That this entire sequence, the various stages of it, come about independent on causes. So one looks at these individual steps, how they like each of the 5 points, how they have their own causes leading to that specific result, and of great importance, the overall causal sequence, which is that our body and mind, our physical mental aggregates, they are naturally subject to suffering because they are contaminated. Why? They've come about independent on the ripening of karma, and that karma is contaminated. Why? Because it was accumulated under the influence of the afflictions. And additionally, the ripening, some of the ripening conditions for the karma are further afflictions. Therefore, those ripening results are naturally subject to suffering. Therefore, all that is born, or to translate it differently, every physical thing that is produced is subject to decline through aging and through illness. This is the reality, the natural state of contaminated phenomena. Therefore, there's no reason to be surprised or upset with this process of decline. This is what will naturally happen. But that doesn't mean it has to be like this. So these two meditations, the two outcomes, the one on impermanence, to challenge our grasping at permanence, and that of dependent arising in relation to cause and effect. These then lead us to understand better the nature of reality on a conventional level, and they are the preliminaries to later coming to understand the nature of reality on an ultimate level. In other words, to meditate on reality, to meditate on emptiness. So these trainings here are the preliminary practices that are required to later actually come to realize emptiness. To have one's meditations on emptiness have sufficient strength to transform our way of thinking and lead to the weakening and eventual abandonment of our afflictions together with their seeds and attain liberation. So through this presentation today, I hope it's clear how these meditations, for them to be transformative, come about independent on the prior meditations, and how these meditations, now we see, are the preliminaries for later meditations. Hence, the need to train in this sequence. And then finally, to make the point that through recognizing the importance of this meditation, one can rejoice in our own good fortune at having met the teachings of the Buddha as presented by Lama Tsongkhapa, having met these teachings which are still alive and vibrant in our world, and therefore rejoicing in our great good fortune, use this to strengthen our determination to utilize what remains of this life well. So thank you. Then I can conclude here for this morning. But if you have questions, we can start with Cameron. Yeah.
There were a couple of points there where you were referring to contaminated phenomena. My thinking on the contamination in samsara was that it is the contamination of the mind. So this table is phenomena, and it is in samsara, but that's not contaminated phenomena, is it? I thought it was contamination of the mind.
Sakpalana nyomo pala gore. Sakche lana nyomo be kin nyomo badan jete badela sakche sku gore. Sakche dinjimji sakche de nyomo ba gore. Sakche ye pungbo la de nyomo ba ma bang be nyomo badan kin xiangwa de son de pungbo de sakche ye pungbo la. Then mi la ba se ji ba mi la de mi gore wa. Mi la ba la de ya mi de lo so di mi di wa jue jue. Dine sakche la de nyomo ba de nyomo ba ko gore. 다 사치이 풍보라 요도 안에 다 풍보라 요도 뇨몽버디다 마더 뇨몽버 샹왕도 송주 경기 풍보들라 사치 풍보라 거. 사치 사치 풍보나라 대야 사치 풍보라 요도 수다 안에 셰바용 이거 거래. 디나 뇨몽버 거래 사치 풍보 책을 봐.
Selpokoso, deningato suksena, dingato sukpo chikpomare, sis chikpomare, yang benpore. Because it's some young sukre.
Yeah, that did you did it.
Okay.
You
need to drop a the young Yomonia Kesome. Because I also take the young
Yomonia. To Garson down to China share the Gang Chele, the long jaggy, Yuji, Sabalet in the Yungurba, that is a Yudan Kinlet in a Jungura, just that they can so sugi le Sabalet in the leggy. 제 레주 군로데 녀모 바르지 용고로 바다 긴데다 녀모 바 충충 지여데 바데 긴래야 긴래야.
So this term contaminated means that it has come about, it's a result of contaminated causes. So when we talk about the five aggregates, we can express this as body and mind. So the mind is contaminated by the afflictions. The body is also a result of a contaminated karma. So therefore the body itself is a true suffering and has come about independent on contaminated causes. But so in terms of five aggregates, the word that can be translated as body, but is really form, but then you're talking about this as form, which just sounds odd in English. Also, the external phenomena of this world are form. They have come about independent on karma. That karma, was it accumulated free of the afflictions or together with afflictions? So together with afflictions. So therefore, our world, which has been created by karma, that karma too is contaminated. So therefore,
The table is contaminated.
yeah,
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
yeah, because the cause is contaminated.
Yeah, thank you.
No, do you sempre göra det? Annie tycker det. Sure. Yeah?
So, my understanding, so this is going back to the suffering of birth. My understanding initially was that birth was the moment of conception where the consciousness enters the sperm and the egg. So we're now saying that birth is that, but it's also when it emerges from the womb or the egg or however you come to be born, wherever you are.
Let's go from some. Alltså kira inte det, men kira. Alltså när man kira sena, alltså om man kopplar levdu, det är alltså kira. Alltså om man så på ne kira, det kira vad det. Alltså om man kopplar levdu, men du sen den vara, det är alltså kira. Ne kira dukne, det du i kolla vad det. Alltså så på om man gissar på ne kira, det är kira i dukne. Det är så på kolla, alltså tyckte kira netan lokani.
대단 안주 기회 동아시에 락바는 마시기로 아주 기와서 메인가도 인생 자와도 기와래 디디급레 동아 유럽에서는 연구래 지사당 안주 다디 마시에 락바는 야시고로 맞 람사 기회 동아 인생 자마타도 여러서는 가서 하고 두고 말와 세상 아메 류 코반 마기여도 다 기와도 아주 지소나래 기와서 니야도 인생 자와 기배 기시고마 지단데다 부기샤 기미도 세디 아니 그 메인가는 된바들 지고로 와제 지용샤네 지소도네 디네자다 기위 동아시에도 락바디시 디담보 락바시 디네야다 이 삼단의 랍삽삽시데 메인가도 인생 자마트 기와들 동아가리 메인가도 인생 자마 타발라 메인가를 기 파미 쿠라 존네 남시 유보데 기와렘바로 와다 제가 데리컬로 동아 가르가르 요래세디 두신 야야 라반 마로야 다정 아주 셰디 라바라바디 메인간네 칠로마 된디 기위 고시고 데디 기위 동아디 라바디 제셔 데디마 기위 동아디 델야다 메인간네 레베진다 안디야 ngal 인생 제위 갑로 동아 가르가르 연구를 해세데 되는 연구를 해세데 좋아야 되다 진짜 당아서 셰디 다디 고주에디 라바디 마 아주 차고야기 내상 돈에 빠진 다 차차 줘야지 바데.
So you're correct. This term birth is used differently in different contexts. So when one takes rebirth in the realm of humans is when at the point of conception. So at the moment that at the point of conception. So that is when rebirth into the realm of humans or animals and so forth happens. In terms then of the context of the suffering of birth, the presentation is birth from the mother. That's when the point of reflection. So the first point was the pain of being born from the mother into the world. That being said, the presentation is in a way that's easy to understand. If one goes deeper and thinks about the suffering of being in the womb, there's no fault with that at all. So from whatever point the baby in the womb can experience suffering, one can reflect from that point too. So, but to come back to your question, the term is used in these different ways.
So, I've been wondering about momentary change or impermanence. Is it always suffering? I know that it's generated from the afflictions, but thinking about a child growing, it doesn't appear to be suffering.
Okay.
디 동아 영화세 디사디 아주 초와 동아 영화의 기시거를 디 말에 다들 동아세에 뒤시 동아시거로 뒤시 동아세에 당아서 놈이다 삼다 동아세에 초와 동아 영화의 삼단에 디 말에 다들 디가선 뒤시 동아시도 찍리 유진에 딜레 뜻이 둘러야 될 동아세입니다. 지난 뒤시 동아세에 되다 동아의 동아세에 가요. 뒤시 동아세 초와 동아 영화에서 다 초와 동아 영화에 계시는 기지를 동아 연구를 해서는 디 영화요 말봐. 아주 대라라야 제 여러 봐다. 니 말에 동아세 다들 뒤시 동아세 가르쳐서 기지기지네 나마들 유르지 또 나마들 또 두루 좋아요 뭐 유두아 차요 저러와 어디를 고고 동아세 다들이
그래서 이 부분에 중심도 액체를 줘도 되니 개치그래에
둘 두어로 돼 누가 예 대신에 빼 저기 그 정보를 빼 야고 줘야 돼 된마 또 두고로 와 시야 타년 두고로 와 두고로 와그 동아스게 때 소화 동아 신도이네 야지리야 체체를 두고로 와 이내 그 동아 영화서요 말봐 니 나시래 다들 동아 용용 세야 동아세야 두지기 동아세야 그 유르지 그 이제 강한 체야 타년이 줘야 진짜 동아서 민다 말해 뭐 동아시고 유두지 동아라 대도 소화 동아 용도 말해 녀행해 봐요 말해.
So the purpose of these reflections is to, on the various sufferings, is to lead us to come to a realization. So whilst we're talking about the eightfold suffering here, if we think of the threefold suffering, we meditate on these eight to come to a actual realization of the threefold presentation, the third, all-pervasive suffering of conditionality. So when we talk about momentary change and suffering, it's not that the feeling of suffering is arising in each moment, so which would be an illustration of the suffering of physical and mental pain. So that is not what's arising in each moment. For example, when a child is aging, but it is actually a reference, the momentary change and suffering is a reference to the all-pervasive suffering of conditionality, which is in that in each moment there is a process of decline. And this is an ongoing process of decline in the sense of, because the very natural, the conventional natural state of samsaric phenomena is that they are subject to suffering. So even if core suffering isn't present, so the suffering feeling isn't present, one is approaching the time when it will happen. And this is the meaning of the all-pervasive suffering of conditionality. So all-pervasive suffering of conditionality doesn't mean in every moment one is suffering, but rather that one is continuously bound in a state where if suffering hasn't befallen one, it will do so. And if one is not suffering, one is nearing the point of suffering. This is the meaning of it. Okay. Then thank you.